The man in the red tunic stood in the middle of Terminal 2 for 41 minutes. For 39 of those minutes, my duty manager was trying to get him thrown out. I know the number because I checked my watch. I check my watch a lot. 19 years pushing wheelchairs through Ellenshaw International will do that to a man. You stop reading the clock like a person and start reading it like a machine. Gate closes at 14:20. Wheelchair assist needs 18 minutes from Zone C to Gate 41 if the travelator's working, 26 if it isn't. My whole life is measured in minutes I don't own. So when I say 41 minutes, I mean 41 minutes. And I mean that in all that time, that soldier did not move. Not his feet, not his eyes, not one finger on the rifle stock. My name's Denny Hollies. I'm 58. I have a bad left knee and a good memory, which is a rotten combination for a man in my line of work. And what I'm about to tell you happened on the 14th of November, which in Brantmere is the sort of day that makes you understand why our national color is gray. Let me set it out properly, because if I just tell you the end, you won't feel it. Ellenshaw is the main airport for the Kingdom of Harrowmere. Sits 11 miles east of the capital, on flat marsh ground that used to be sheep pasture before somebody with a big idea and a bigger budget poured concrete on it. 2 terminals. Terminal 1 is the shiny one, all glass and duty-free perfume and a piano nobody ever plays. Terminal 2 is the old one. Low ceilings, brown carpet tiles, a departures board that still clacks when it updates. I work Terminal 2, always have. The tourists go to 1. 2 gets the long-haul freight crews, the charter flights, the military rotations out of Kestrel barracks, and the families who can't afford to fly from the pretty building. That morning the rain came in sideways off the marsh. Not heavy, just relentless. The kind that doesn't fall so much as hang in the air waiting for you to walk into it. The roof over the drop-off drums when it's like that. You can hear it inside under the announcements like somebody upstairs tapping their fingers. I clocked on at 6. Had a coffee from the machine near the staff lift. It tastes like a hot coin, but it's free, so nobody complains twice. Terminal 2 smelled the way it always smells at that hour. Wet coats, floor polish, bacon from the Wingspan Cafe, which does 2 things well and 11 things badly. By 8 the concourse had that slow morning shuffle. Delayed Terburg flight, so a crowd of businessmen with their ties already loosened. A school group heading somewhere warm, all in matching hoodies, the teacher counting heads over and over like she didn't trust arithmetic. A woman by gate 38 crying quietly into a phone, which, honestly, you see 3 or 4 times a shift and you learn to look away. Normal morning, gray, damp, loud, normal. Then at 08:52, I pushed Mrs. Alderway out of the lift on level 1, and I saw him. He was standing near the west end of the concourse, in the wide bit where the terminal opens up before it narrows into the gates. Past the wingspan, just before the big window that looks out onto stand 14. Full ceremonial, the scarlet tunic, the bearskin, the white belt, the black boots polished to that impossible mirror shine that isn't shine anymore, it's more like water. Rifle at the order, but on the deck beside his right foot, hand flat on the stock. And I thought, first honest thought, I'm not proud of it. Oh, they've put a photo op on, marketing again. Because that's what you assume. Ellenshaw does that sort of thing. They had pipers in the arrivals hall once for a tourism campaign and a man in a mascot suit for the summer schedule launch. So my brain filed him under nonsense and moved on. Mrs. Alderway didn't file him under nonsense. She was 81 and going to see her son in Vessiter. She grabbed the arm of the chair and said, "Denny, stop." I stopped. She looked at him for a good 10 seconds. Then she said very quietly, "That's not for the cameras." I said, "How do you mean?" She said, "There aren't any cameras." And she was right. There wasn't a photographer. There wasn't a press officer with a lanyard and a clipboard. There wasn't a rope line or a sign or one of those pull-up banners they drag out for everything. There was just a man in scarlet standing alone in a brown-carpeted airport concourse at 10 to 9 in the morning, facing the window, with rain running down the glass in front of him. And he was facing stand 14, which was empty. Now here's the thing you need to understand about stand 14, because it matters. Stand 14 is the one at the far west corner. It's not a passenger stand, not really. It's got a hard stand, a bit of apron, and it's used for freight, for diversions, and a few times a year for repatriations. I'd seen 2 in my 19 years. You don't forget them. They bring the aircraft in quiet. No announcement. The stand gets cleared. There's a vehicle, and there are men, and everybody in the terminal who happens to be looking out of that window stops talking for about 4 minutes without anybody telling them to. That morning, stand 14 had 2 orange cones out on the apron, and nothing else. Which meant something was coming. I dropped Mrs. Alderway at 38. She squeezed my hand, said, "God bless that boy." And I said, "He'll be fine, love," which was a stupid thing to say, and I knew it as it left my mouth. Then I went back. I didn't have a reason. I had a 9:15 assist waiting at Zone C and a radio on my hip that was going to start squawking at me in about 6 minutes. But I went back. I got about 12 feet from him and stopped, off to his left, near the pillar with the fire extinguisher on it. Close up, he was younger than I'd thought. 26, 27 maybe. Fair skin gone slightly pink from the cold outside. He'd walked in from somewhere, not been dropped at the door. His jaw was set. Chin strap of the bearskin sitting right at the point of it, the way it does when they've had it fitted properly. Water on his boots, just a few beads, rain. And his eyes, I want to be careful here, because this is the part people don't believe. His eyes were wet. Not crying, nothing running, but wet in that way where a man is holding a thing back with every muscle in his face, and the only place it can get out is right at the edge of his eyes, where it just sits there and shines. He wasn't blinking much, and his eyes weren't on the window. They were on the empty stand beyond it. That's when the radio went. "Denny, Zone C, 9:15 assist, you receiving." I turned my back on him to answer it, which felt, I don't know, rude, like turning your back in a church. "Denny receiving. 2 minutes. Make it 1, love, she's in a state." I clipped the radio back on, and as I did, I heard a voice behind me that I'd have recognized in a coma. "Right, what's this then?" "Grantham Doyle, duty manager, Terminal 2, 44. High-vis vest he did not need, iPad he did not use, and a way of saying words like this that made them sound like something he'd found on his shoe. I should be fair to Doyle. I'm going to try. It's hard, but I'm going to try. Doyle wasn't a cruel man. He was a frightened man who'd been given a lanyard, and those are more dangerous than cruel men because they never think they're doing anything wrong. He'd been at Ellenshaw 6 years, and he had a phrase he used about 11 times a shift. "It's not about me, it's about the process." He said that like it was a defense. It was actually a confession. 2 months before this, a bloke had gone through Terminal 2 collecting for a children's ward. Had the tin and everything, all above board, cleared by somebody upstairs. Doyle moved him on because the paperwork mentioned Terminal 1 and not Terminal 2, and technically, on paper, in the small hours of a Tuesday, Grantham Doyle was correct. That's who was walking up behind me. He came round my shoulder and stopped in front of the guard. Not right in front. About 6 feet off, at an angle, the way you approach a dog you're not sure about. He looked him up and down. The tunic, the bear, the rifle. The rifle bothered him. You could see it land on his face. "Morning," Doyle said, bright, too bright. "Are you with a party?" "Nothing." The guard did not look at him, did not acknowledge that a human being had made a noise in his direction, stood exactly as he'd been standing, eyes forward, hand on the stock. Doyle laughed, that little airport laugh, the one that means I am about to become a problem for you. "Sir, can I ask what this is in aid of? Only I've not been notified of anything." "Nothing." The rain drummed on the roof. Somewhere behind us, the departures board clacked over, and 100 people looked up at once, and then looked back down. Doyle turned to me. "Denny, you know about this?" "No." "Has Ops said anything?" "Not to me." I pushed chairs, Grantham. He didn't like that. He tapped the iPad against his leg. Tap, tap, tap. He looked at the guard again, and I watched him make a decision. I actually watched it happen, the way you can see a man choose the wrong door. "Right," he said. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. This is a walkway. It's a designated walkway. We can't have obstructions in a designated walkway." Now I want to be clear. It was not a walkway. It was an 11-meter wide open concourse with about 40 people in it and one man standing near the west window. You could have parked a bus beside him and still got a family of 5 and a luggage trolley past. But once Doyle said designated walkway, it became true. Because he'd said it out loud, and to a man like Doyle, saying a thing out loud is the same as it being real. The guard didn't move. He didn't move so completely that it started to feel like a physical force. You know when a room goes still and you can't work out why, and then you realize it's because one person in it has stopped. That's what it was like. People 40 feet away at the coffee stand had turned round. They didn't know what they were watching. They just knew there was a stillness in the west end of the concourse, and their bodies had noticed it before their brains had. Doyle stepped closer, 4 feet now. "Sir, I'm the duty manager. I'm going to need you to acknowledge me." And I thought, mate, don't. Because there is a particular kind of silence a soldier gives you, and it isn't rudeness. It's not even disrespect. It's a door. He's telling you he is not available. He is on something. He is inside something, and you are outside it, and there is nothing you can do about that except leave. Doyle heard that silence and thought it was a challenge. "Denny," he said without turning, "get ops on the radio and get security. Actual security, not the door lads." "Grantham. Radio Denny." I didn't touch the radio. I'm not going to dress that up. I didn't refuse out of courage. I refused because my hands had gone strange and I was looking at that young man's eyes, which had not moved, which were still wet, which were still on that empty stand, and I could not make my arm go to my hip. Doyle did it himself, pulled his own radio. "Ops, this is Doyle, T2. I've got an unauthorized individual in the West Concourse, ceremonial dress, and he appears to be carrying a firearm, requesting security to my location." And the word firearm went across that concourse like a dropped tray. Two things happened at once. First, a family near the wingspan grabbed their kids. Actually grabbed them, pulled them in by the shoulders, the mother's face going white. Because it's an airport, and it's this century, and you say that word in an airport and people's bodies remember things their minds have never seen. Second, the guard's jaw tightened. That's all, that's the entire movement. A tightening at the hinge of the jaw just under the strap of the bearskin. But I saw it and it told me everything. He'd heard every single word Doyle had said from the beginning. Everyone. He'd heard, "Are you with a party?" and designated walkway and acknowledge me, and he had let all of it go past him like weather. But firearm got in. Because that rifle wasn't a firearm to him. It was a piece of a thing he was doing. And Doyle had just called it a threat in front of 100 strangers, and made the whole reason he was standing there sound like a crime. I saw the tendons go in the back of his hand on the stock. And he still didn't move. The security lads came at a jog, 2 of them. Big fella called Ruari Neve, who I'd known since he was a boy on the trolleys, and a younger one, pikeman, who'd been there about 8 months, and had the eyes of a lad who wanted something to happen. Neve took one look and slowed right down, went from a jog to a walk to a stop about 15 feet out. I watched his face do the maths. Scarlet tunic, bearskin, boots, rifle at the order, bayonet not fixed, magazine well empty and open, you could see it. The thing was as loaded as a broom handle. Neve looked at the guard, then out at stand 14 and the 2 orange cones, then back. And Ruari Neve, who I have seen carry a drunk man out of departures under one arm like a rolled carpet, took his hat off. Just took it off, held it in front of him. Doyle said, "Ruari, what are you doing?" Neve said, "Grantham, do you know what's on the 1140? Doyle looked at his iPad, actually looked at it, scrolled. "There is no 1140, he said. "Stand 14's showing empty all day." Neve said, "It would." And that right there, was the moment I understood I was not watching a man being difficult. I was watching a man waiting. Doyle didn't get it. He genuinely did not get it, and God help me, I've thought about that 100 times since, because it would have taken him about 4 seconds to ask one decent question, and he never did. He'd committed, that's the thing. He'd said firearm on an open channel. He'd called security. He'd made a shape in front of witnesses, and now the only thing his brain could do was defend the shape. So he stepped right up, 2 feet, close enough that the guard would have been able to see him properly if he'd been looking at anything in this world, which he wasn't. And Doyle put his hand on the man's sleeve. I heard somebody behind me say, "Oh, don't." It might have been me. The guard's arm was like a banister. Doyle's hand on it did nothing at all, and I think that's what undid him, the total lack of consequence. He'd touched a man, and the man had not registered the touch. "Right," Doyle said, and his voice had gone up half a step. "Right, sir, you're on private property." You are in a controlled, airside adjacent zone in ceremonial dress with a weapon and no notification, no permit, no escort, and I have got a duty of care to 4,000 passengers this morning. So you are going to move, or I am going to have you removed. And then for the first time I'm telling you I checked, 31 minutes the royal guard spoke. He didn't turn his head, didn't look at him. He said quietly, in a voice like a door closing, 11:40. Doyle blinked. What? 11:40, sir. There's nothing on the 11:40. Yes, sir, said the guard, there is. And then he shut again, like a book. Doyle stood there with his hand still on the man's sleeve and his mouth slightly open, and I could see it happening, the first crack. The first tiny leak of doubt into the sealed box of Grantham Doyle. He didn't know what was on the 11:40. Neve did. I was starting too. Doyle had the iPad and the lanyard and the vest, and he was the only man in that circle who didn't know what he was standing in the middle of. And instead of asking, he doubled. He turned to Pikeman, the young one, the one with the eyes, and he said, "Escort him out." Neve said, "Grantham, no. That's an instruction." "Grantham, that is an instruction, Ruari, and I'll note who followed it." And that's the thing about a man like Doyle. That's the actual weapon he had, not the vest, not the radio. I'll note who followed it. Ruari Neve had a mortgage and 3 kids and 11 years in. Pikeman had 8 months and a probation review coming. Pikeman stepped forward. Now I've thought about this a lot, years on and off, about what I did next, which was nothing, and about what I should have done, which was something. But I'll tell you what actually stopped it, and it wasn't me. It was a sound. Everybody heard it at the same time. That low, building drag of noise that you don't hear so much as feel in the floor tiles. And if you work at an airport, you can tell a 737 from an A320 from a Kestrel-class transport with your eyes shut, because your feet learn it before your ears do. Heavy 4 engines, coming in low over the marsh from the east. Military. And 100 and something people in Terminal 2 turned as one body towards the west window. Pikeman stopped with his hand halfway to the man's shoulder. Doyle turned round, and out through that rain-streaked glass, on final approach into Ellenshaw, gray against a gray sky, with its landing lights burning through the water in the air, was an aircraft that was not on Grantham Doyle's iPad, coming down onto a stand that was showing empty all day. The guard's chest rose, once slow, and I heard him breathe out, and it shook. Just that once, just for a second. Then his hand came up off the stock, and in one movement, sharp, clean, the kind of movement that takes 10,000 repetitions and one broken heart to produce, he brought that rifle up and locked it into the present. Alone, in a brown-carpeted airport concourse. In front of a duty manager, 2 security guards, a wheelchair attendant, a school group in matching hoodies, and 100 strangers who had no idea what they were about to be part of. Doyle said, What is that? What's on that aircraft?" And Ruari Neve, hat still in his hand, said, "A boy called Emmett Cray." I didn't know that name yet. Nobody in that terminal did except 2 men. By 6 o'clock that evening, the whole kingdom of Harrowmere knew it. And by then, Grantham Doyle had done the single worst thing I have ever watched a man do. And then, about 90 seconds after that, something happened in Terminal 2 that I still cannot describe to my wife without having to stop and start again. I'll tell you both. The aircraft touched down at 11:38. I know because I checked. Of course I checked. It came in slow and heavy, and it hit the runway with that long gray rumble that goes up through the building, through the floor tiles, through the soles of your shoes and into your knees. Every window in the West End had a face at it by then. People had left their coffees. A lad from the school group was standing on a bench, and for once nobody told him to get down. And out on the wet apron, one after another, the airport's own vehicles were stopping. That's the bit I remember most, actually, not the plane, the vehicles. A baggage tug halfway to stand 22 just stopped, pulled over. Driver got out into the rain and stood beside it. Then a fuel Bowser, then a catering truck. Then the little pushback tractor near stand 16, which stopped where it was, engine running, door open. Nobody told them to. There was no announcement. There was no instruction on any channel. I'd have heard it. My radio was on my hip. They just knew. Ground crew always know before the terminal knows. They talk to each other on frequencies the rest of us never hear, and they'd known since about 7 that morning what was coming into Ellenshaw on a stand that was showing empty all day. Everyone knew, Ops knew, Neve knew, the tug drivers knew. Grantham Doyle didn't know, because Grantham Doyle had never once in 6 years asked anybody a question he didn't already have the answer to. And he was still talking. That's the part I want you to sit with for a second. That aircraft was on the ground, rolling out, and Doyle was still talking. Right, no, hang on. Ruari, who authorized a movement onto 14, who signed that, because I've got nothing on the system. Grantham, Neve said, put the iPad down. I've got a duty of care. Put it down, mate. But he couldn't, that's what I mean about him. He genuinely could not. The system said empty, and reality said full, and instead of the system being wrong, reality had to be an unauthorized movement. He turned back to the guard. The lad was still at the present, rifle up locked, dead vertical, bearskin dead straight, eyes on that stand. And Doyle, and I'd give a lot to unsee this, Doyle put himself in front of him. Directly in front. Stepped into the space between that soldier and the window. So the only thing that young man could see was a high-vis vest and a lanyard. Sir, look at me, look at me. You do not have clearance to be in this terminal. There's a sound 100 people make when they all breathe in at once. It's not loud, it's the opposite of loud. It's like the room taking something back. I heard it. And the guard, I swear on my mother, the guard's eyes did not move to him. They stayed exactly where they'd been, which meant now that he was looking at nothing. At the middle of a stranger's chest, at a bit of yellow plastic. And still he held the present. Held it while the man who'd made himself into a wall stood 18 inches away shouting about clearance. His hands were shaking. Just at the very end of the rifle, right at the muzzle, that tiny tremble you get when a man is using every ounce of what he's got to not do the thing his whole body is screaming to do. I have never in my life been closer to watching a human being break in half. Ruari Neve moved. Big man, bigger than you'd think until he's coming at you. He got hold of Doyle's arm above the elbow and he said, quiet, right into the side of his head. Grantham, step out of that man's eye line. Get off me. Step out of his eye line. Ruari, you're on shift, you're on shift. And Neve said something then that I've never forgotten, because it was the plainest sentence anybody said that whole morning. He said, there's a coffin on that plane. Doyle stopped. His mouth was still open. His hand was still up. And I watched the words go into him, and I watched them not land. I watched him hear it and process it and file it and not feel it, because he was 6 years deep into a job where nothing was allowed to be true unless it was on a screen. He said, that's not been notified. And Neve let go of his arm like it had gone bad in his hand. Let me tell you about Emmett Cray now, because you need him for the rest of this. I got most of it later from Neve, and some of it from the papers, and a bit of it from a woman I'll get to. Emmett Cray was 23, from Balwick, which is a nothing town about 40 miles north, 2 chip shops and a bus that comes when it feels like it. His mum cleaned offices. His dad was gone before he could talk. He joined at 18. He wasn't a hero, particularly. He wasn't the best shot or the fastest runner or the one they put on the recruiting posters. Neve said the phrase people kept using about him was good lad. That's it. That's the whole eulogy from the men who knew him. Good lad, always had a brew on, never once complained about a stag rotation, not once, which apparently is rarer than bravery. He'd been out on a joint deployment. Vehicle went into a culvert on a road that had been swept twice that week and was clear both times. 3 men in the back. Emmett Cray got 2 of them out. He went back for the third. The third one's name was Corporal Ilan Mercer. And Corporal Ilan Mercer was the man standing in the middle of Terminal 2 in a scarlet tunic with his hands shaking on a rifle. Yeah, that's the bit. Mercer had been in that vehicle. Mercer was the third man. Emmett Cray went back into a burning wreck for a bloke he'd known 11 months and got him out and did not come back out himself. Mercer had 11 pins in his left leg and a medical downgrade and a piece of paper somewhere in a file that said he was not, repeat, not cleared for ceremonial duties. He'd put the tunic on anyway. He'd got a train at 4:30 in the morning from a rehab facility 80 miles away, in full ceremonial in the rain, with a rifle he'd signed out on a form that I am absolutely certain was not filled in correctly. Because Emmett Cray was coming home on the 11:40, and Emmett Cray's mother could not afford to be there, and the repatriation was a private movement with no honor guard because of some scheduling thing between two departments that nobody's ever properly explained. Nobody was going to be standing there. So Ilan Mercer stood there. That's it, that's the whole story. A man was owed a salute and the system had lost the paperwork, so a broken soldier got on a train and paid it himself. And Grantham Doyle called it an obstruction in a designated walkway. Out on the apron, the aircraft turned onto stand 14 and stopped. The rain had eased off, not stopped, eased, gone from sideways to just falling, which in Brantmere in November counts as a clear spell. The ramp came down, and there were 8 men. 8 of them in service dress, formed up on the wet concrete beside that aircraft, and they had come from somewhere, God knows where, because they hadn't been there 10 minutes before. Somebody had got them there. Somebody in a room somewhere had made a phone call, and I've never found out who, and I've stopped trying. They went up the ramp, and Terminal 2 went silent. Not quiet, silent. The departures board clacked, and it sounded like a gunshot. Somebody's phone rang, and they killed it so fast you'd have thought it burnt them. The school group, 30 kids, 12, 13 years old, the age where they physically cannot stop moving, 30 of them stood absolutely still with their faces against that window. The teacher was crying, hand over her mouth, not making a sound. And Ilan Mercer, with a high-vis vest still 18 inches from his nose, held the present. Doyle didn't move. I need you to understand that. The plane was there. The men were there. The ramp was down. And Grantham Doyle was still standing between a soldier and the only thing that soldier had come for. Because he'd said firearm on an open channel and there was a recording of it, and somewhere in the back of his frightened little mind, he'd already worked out that if this was real, he was finished. And so it could not be real. It could not be allowed to be real. He said, I need to see a permit. He actually said that to a man watching his friend's coffin come off a plane. I need to see a permit. Ruari Neve hit him. No, he didn't. I want that to be the story. It isn't. What Ruari Neve did was worse for Doyle and better for everybody else. And it's the single finest thing I've ever watched a man do in an airport. He stepped past Doyle, took 2 paces, put himself beside Ilan Mercer, beside, not in front, on his right, at the exact interval you'd stand at if you'd done it before. Took his hat off, put it under his arm. Came to attention. Ruari Neve, 51, airport security, 11 years in the terminal and 6 before that in a uniform he'd never once mentioned to any of us. Came to attention on a brown carpet tile in Terminal 2 and stared out at stand 14. And then Pikeman, the young lad, the one who'd been about to grab Mercer's shoulder 90 seconds earlier. Pikeman looked at Neve and looked at Doyle and looked at the window. And Pikeman came to attention on the other side. Then the tug driver's wife did it. I didn't know that's who she was at the time. She was just a woman in a wingspan cafe apron who'd come out from behind the counter, and she walked across that concourse and stood behind Mercer and put her hands down at her sides and stood still. Then a businessman with his tie loose stood up, left his bag. Then the teacher. And then, God help me, 30 kids in matching hoodies, all of them, no messing about, no giggling, standing in a ragged line by that window with their arms straight down. Then the woman who'd been crying into her phone at gate 38. Then 2 Terberg pilots. Then the fella who does the news agents, who'd left the shutter half up. I want to tell you it was orderly. It wasn't. It was the messiest, most ill-arranged, most human thing you have ever seen. People shuffling. People not knowing where to put their hands. An old boy who couldn't get his cap off because of his shoulder, so he just held it against his chest. They didn't know what to do. Not one of them knew the drill. They did it anyway. By the time the 8 men came back down that ramp, there were about 140 people standing at the west window of Terminal 2. And one man in a high-vis vest in the middle of them, still holding an iPad. The whole terminal had formed up around him, not against him, around him, like water round a stone. Nobody said a word to Doyle. Nobody told him to move. They just made him into the only person in the building who was still sitting down, while standing up. I've thought about that a lot. They brought Emmett Cray off that aircraft slow. Flag over him. 8 men. That short step carry that they do, you've seen it. Everybody's seen it on the telly. It's different when it's 11 meters of wet glass away from your face. The rain was coming down on the flag, and it went dark where it landed. And Ilan Mercer's arms were locked, and his jaw was locked, and his eyes were streaming, properly now, running down his face, off his chin, onto that scarlet tunic. And he did not blink, and he did not lower that rifle, and he did not make one sound. Not one. There was 140 of us in that terminal, and I would swear to you that the loudest noise in the building was the rain on the roof. They put him in the hearse. The 8 men held it. Then they turned and went back up the ramp. And the vehicle pulled away west, past stand 16, past the tug that was still sitting there with its door open, and out through the gate. And when it was gone, Ilan Mercer brought the rifle down to the order. Sharp, clean, perfect, same as it went up. And then he stood there for about 4 seconds with the whole thing coming off him. His shoulders went, just went, and he pulled them back so hard I heard his tunic creak. Then he turned, right turn, textbook, boots together. And he walked out. Nobody clapped. I want you to know that. Nobody clapped, nobody filmed it, nobody shouted. 140 people watched a lad in scarlet walk the length of Terminal 2 on a bad leg with 11 pins in it, and every single one of them got out of his way, and not one of them said a word. He got about halfway, and an old woman in a wheelchair by gate 38, Mrs. Alderway, 81, going to see her son in Vessiter, put her hand out into the aisle as he passed. Just put it out. And Ilan Mercer stopped and looked down at her and took her hand for about 2 seconds. And then he kept walking. I didn't follow him. I had a 9:15 assist that had been waiting since 9:15, and it was now 11:45. And Zone C had been radioing me on and off for 2.5 hours, and I had turned my radio down to nothing, which is a disciplinary matter at Ellenshaw International. So was refusing a direct instruction from a duty manager. So was leaving your assigned zone without notification. And at 12:04 that afternoon, Grantham Doyle, who had watched 140 people form up around him and had understood exactly none of it, sat down at a desk on the mezzanine and started writing. He wrote up Ruari Neve, he wrote up Pikeman. He wrote me up. And then he did the thing that finished him, and it wasn't any of that. He filed an incident report about an unauthorized armed individual in Terminal 2, timed 08, 52 to 11:53, and he named Corporal Ilan Mercer on it. By name, regiment, rifle serial. And he sent it to the airport authority, and he copied it, as procedure requires, to the man's unit. He reported him. He reported a soldier for saluting his own dead. Now here's what Doyle didn't know. At 11:41 that morning, while 8 men were going up a ramp on stand 14, a woman was standing on the mezzanine level of Terminal 2, at the rail looking down. She'd been there 20 minutes. She'd come in at 11, quiet, with a lanyard she didn't show anybody, and she'd watched the whole thing from above, the vest, the iPad, the 2 feet of space, the 140 people, all of it. And she'd taken her phone out. Not to film it. To make a call. Her name was Roswin Hale, and by 4 o'clock that afternoon, every ranking officer at Kestrel Barracks knew exactly what had happened at Ellenshaw International. And by 6 o'clock, the airport authority's chief executive was standing in a car park in the rain trying to get through to a number that was not answering. And the thing that broke it, the thing that turned this from an incident into the reason I'm telling you this at all, was the 4 seconds of footage. Not of Mercer. Of the school group. The video was 14 seconds long, and for about 11 of those seconds you can't see a soldier at all. That's why it worked, I think. Everyone's got a video of a man in a bearskin. There's 100,000 of them. Tourists collect them like stamps. Nobody's got this. A lad called Tobin Frayne shot it. 13 years old, in a maroon hoodie with his school's crest on the chest, on a phone with a cracked screen because he dropped it in a car park in September, and his mum wouldn't get it fixed. He'd filmed it because he was 13, and something was happening. He'd stopped filming after 14 seconds because he was 13, and he'd realized halfway through that he shouldn't be. You can actually see it happen. The camera's up, wobbling, pointed at the window, and then it starts to come down, slowly, like an arm getting heavy. The last 2 seconds are the brown carpet and his own trainers. He put the phone in his pocket and stood up straight with the rest of them. That's the video. That's the whole thing. 30-odd kids in maroon hoodies against a rain-streaked window, a fuel Bowser stopped dead on the apron behind them, and a phone giving up because a boy decided some things aren't for filming. You can hear the rain. You can hear one kid sniff. And right at the edge of frame, for about a second and a half before the camera drops, a bit of scarlet and a bit of yellow high-vis standing 18 inches in front of it. That second and a half is what finished Grantham Doyle. But that came later. That was Thursday. Let me do the Tuesday properly first, because the Tuesday is where you find out who people actually are. Roswyn Hale, 54, gray bob, glasses on a chain, the kind of quiet raincoat that costs more than my car. She'd been standing at the mezzanine rail from about 11, and I'd walked straight past her twice without seeing her, because she was a middle-aged woman standing still in an airport, which is the closest thing to invisibility this world has invented. She was Emmett Cray's aunt. That's it, that's the twist, and it isn't one. She wasn't a general. She wasn't a palace official. The papers all wanted her to be somebody, and she flatly wasn't. She was his mum's sister, and she'd driven down from Balwick at 5 in the morning because Ada Cray, Emmett's mother, couldn't do it. Physically couldn't. She'd got as far as the front door of her own house on Tuesday morning and sat down on the step in her coat and couldn't stand up again. So Roswyn came instead, to stand in for her. To be able to tell her, afterwards, that somebody from the family had been in the building. She'd expected to be the only one. That's what she told me, months later in a kitchen in Balwick with the rain doing exactly what it always does up there. She said, "Denny, I came to stand at a window on my own. I thought I'd be the only person in that whole airport who knew his name." And instead she'd looked down over that rail and seen 140 strangers. She'd also seen the vest. She'd watched Doyle put himself between Ilan Mercer and the glass. She'd watched him say, "I need to see a permit." She couldn't hear it. She was 40 feet up, but she could read the shape of a man saying it. And Roswyn Hale had not phoned a general. She'd phoned her sister. That was the call. That's the whole call. She stood at that rail and phoned Ada Cray and held the phone out over the drop so that a woman sitting on a doorstep 40 miles north could hear an airport go silent for her son. Ada Cray listened to 2 minutes of rain on a roof and 140 people not saying anything. Then Roswyn said, "There's a lad here in the red, in the full kit. He stood to attention, love. He's been stood there since 9. And Ada said, Roswyn's words, not mine, "Rose, who is he?" And Roswyn said, "I don't know." And Ada Cray said, "Then he's not doing it for a photo, is he?" Doyle's report went in at 12:04. Airport authority copied to Kestrel Barracks. Named, regiment, rifle serial number which he'd got off the ledger somebody had let him look at. I've seen it. Neve got hold of it eventually, don't ask me how. It's a horrible document, not because it's a lie, that's the sick thing. It isn't a lie. It's accurate. Every line of it is technically, procedurally, factually correct. Individual entered T2 landside at approx. 0847 in ceremonial dress carrying a service rifle. No permit produced. No escort. Individual failed to respond to repeated verbal instruction. Individual remained in a designated walkway for a period of approx. 61 minutes causing passenger congestion and distress. Staff observed to abandon assigned posts. Every word true, every word. And it captures nothing, not one thing. You could read that report 100 times and never once find a coffin in it. That's what a man like Doyle actually does. He doesn't lie. He just leaves the truth out and calls what's left a fact. Here's what happened at Kestrel Barracks when it landed. Nothing. For 4 hours, nothing. It sat in an inbox. Then at about 4:10, a warrant officer called Strew and Blig opened it, read it twice, and walked it, physically walked it on paper down a corridor into an office and put it on a desk and said, "Sir, you need to see this before it goes anywhere." Because Blig had known Emmett Cray. Everybody at Kestrel had known Emmett Cray. He'd been dead 9 days, and there was still a mug with his name Tipexed on it in the block. And Bligg knew exactly one other thing, which nobody at Ellenshaw knew. That Corporal Ilan Mercer had put in a written request 11 days earlier to be part of the honor guard for the repatriation, and that request had been refused in writing on medical grounds. Downgraded, not fit. 11 pins. The refusal was correct, too. That's the whole of it, isn't it? Everybody in this story was correct. Mercer got picked up Tuesday night at the rehab facility. Not arrested, nothing like that, don't picture handcuffs. 2 blokes in a car, very quiet, very polite, and a drive back to Kestrel. He'd taken the tunic off, hung it up, cleaned the rifle and signed it back in and made the entry in the ledger himself, which, I'll be honest, is the detail that gets me. He came back from the worst morning of his life, and he cleaned a rifle properly before he let himself sit down. They asked him why he'd done it. Neve got this from Bligg, and Bligg had been in the room, so as close to source as we're getting. Mercer said, "Nobody was going to be there, sir." And the officer said, "You were told no." And Mercer said, "Yes, sir." And the officer said, "So why?" And Ilan Mercer sat in that room with 11 pins in his leg and said, "Because he wasn't told no, he went back in. Nobody told him he had to." Nobody said anything for a bit after that. Then the officer said, "You understand I've got a report on my desk that says you're an unauthorized armed individual in a civilian terminal." And Mercer said, "Yes, sir, that's accurate, sir." He didn't fight it. Not once, not one word in his own defense the whole way through. "That's accurate, sir." Wednesday was the worst day of my working life, and almost nothing happened in it. I got called up to the mezzanine at 7:30 in the morning. Doyle wasn't there. He was in a meeting somewhere with the words "process review" in the title, and it was a woman from HR I'd never met, and a man from the authority in a suit, and they had a printout. Radio turned down to 09:16 to 11:53. Assigned zone abandoned, 08:52 to 11:53. Direct instruction from duty manager refused, 09:04. And the HR woman said, quite kindly actually, "Denny, we just need to understand what you were doing for 3 hours." And I said, "I was standing at a window." She wrote that down. She actually wrote it down. And then she said, "Why?" And I opened my mouth and I couldn't. I'm not being dramatic with you. I could not make the sentence. I got as far as "because there was a lad." And my throat closed up like a fist, and I had to sit there in a glass box on the mezzanine of an airport at 20 to 8 in the morning, 58 years old, with my hands over my face. The man from the authority didn't write anything down. He just looked out through the glass at the west end of the concourse, at the window, at stand 14, which had 2 orange cones on it and nothing else. And after about a minute he said, "Right, Denny, go and have a cup of tea. We'll do this another day." We never did it another day. Neve got a first written warning and told them where to put it, and they took it back off him about 9 days later without ever explaining why. Pikeman got nothing. Doyle had put him on the report, of course he had. The lad had followed the instruction. He'd done exactly what he was told. But somebody upstairs looked at an 8-month probationer who'd been ordered to move a grieving soldier and had, at the last second, chosen to stand beside him instead and quietly bin the whole thing. Pikeman's still there, by the way. Ruari Neve's deputy now. 26 years old and the only man in Terminal 2 who can talk down a drunk without touching him. He told me once he thinks about that 90 seconds every single week, about how close his hand got to Ilan Mercer's shoulder. He says it's the most useful memory he's got. Thursday, Tobin Frain's video went up. Not by him. His mum put it on a village Facebook page with about 400 members because she was proud of him, because he'd rung her from the coach on the way home and told her what he'd seen, and then gone quiet on the phone for a bit. 400 members. By Thursday tea time, it was on the national news. Not the papers first, the papers came second, they always do. It went sideways the way things do now. One person shared it, and then a man investigator shared it, and then somebody who'd been in that terminal saw it and commented 3 words underneath. "I was there." And then somebody else, "I was there." And then it was 40 people, then 200. Underneath a 14-second video of some kids at a window. I was there, I was there, I was there. They found Ada Cray by Friday morning. Of course they did. She wouldn't talk to any of them. Not one. Her sister stood at the door of that house in Balwick like the west wall of a castle and said the same 11 words to every reporter who came up the path. She's not well and you're standing on her son's front step. But on the Friday evening, Ada Cray did do one thing. She wrote 4 sentences and gave them to Roswin to read out at the gate. I'm not going to try and improve them. She wrote, I couldn't be there. I've had to live with that for 3 days. A boy I have never met stood in my place for over an hour and let people shout at him for it. Whoever raised him, you did it right. That was it, that's the whole statement. And the thing is, whoever raised him, she didn't know. Nobody had told her his name yet. She still didn't know who he was. She was thanking a stranger. Saturday, the airport authority put out a statement. You know the sort, regret, reviewing, colleagues acted in accordance with, lessons will be. It lasted about 4 hours. Because on Saturday afternoon, somebody leaked Doyle's report. The actual document, all of it, the permit line, the rifle serial, designated walkway. And that was the end. Not because people hated him, it's worse than that. It's because 100,000 people read a document that was completely accurate and understood, all at once, in about the same 4 seconds, that they had all met a Grantham Doyle. Every single one of them. They'd all had a form come back for a missing box. They'd all been told no by somebody who couldn't tell you why, only that the system said so. He stopped being a man that Saturday and turned into a feeling everybody already had. I wouldn't wish that on anybody, I mean that. I've got no love for him and I still wouldn't wish it. He resigned on the Monday, before they could do anything to him, which, honestly, I don't think they were going to. He got out ahead of it. I saw him once more, about 3 weeks after. He was in the short-stay car park at about 7 in the morning, sitting in his car with the engine off, not going anywhere. I could have walked past. I knocked on the window. He put it down about 4 inches. And I said, Grantham. And he said, Denny. And then neither of us said anything for a bit, and the rain did what it does. And then he said, and I've never told anybody this bit, not even my wife, so you're getting it fresh, he said. I didn't know. And I said, I know you didn't. And he said, I'd have Denny if somebody had just said. And I stopped him, because I'm not a cruel man either, but there's a limit. I said, Ruari told you. He told you there was a coffin on the plane, and you asked if it had been notified. And Grantham Doyle sat in his car in a short-stay car park and looked at his own steering wheel for a very long time. And then he put the window up. I've never seen him since. Now Mercer. They didn't charge him. They came close. There were people who wanted to, and I'll defend them slightly, because if you let one bloke sign out a rifle and get on a train because his heart's broken, you've got a problem with the next one, and the one after that, and eventually you've got a real problem. The rules aren't there for the good men. They're there for the 10th man. But they didn't charge him. What they did instead was, and I love this, I genuinely love this, they made him do it properly. Emmett Cray's funeral was the following Thursday in Balwick, at a church that holds about 90 people, and had 400 outside in the rain. And they put Ilan Mercer on the honor guard. Same lad, same downgrade, same 11 pins. They looked at a medical refusal that was completely correct, and somebody, I don't know who, I've never found out, and Blig went to his grave not telling anybody. Somebody found a way to make it wrong. He carried him, 11 pins and all, front left. He didn't drop him, not for a second, not an inch. And Ada Cray met him at the church door afterwards and put both hands on his face like he was about 9 years old, and neither of them said a single word to each other, not one. And that photo is the one that's still up on the wall of the Wingspan Cafe in Terminal 2 if you ever want to go and look at it. That's most of it. Some odds and ends, because I know you'll want them. Stand 14 doesn't show empty anymore. That's a real thing that changed. There's a protocol now, a proper one, written down, and if a repatriation's coming into Ellenshaw, the terminal knows. Ground staff know. Duty managers know. There's a line in the system now where there wasn't one, and no, nobody at that airport will tell you it's called anything, but everybody who works there calls it the same thing. They call it Cray's Rule. Nobody made that up. It just happened. That's how these things get named. Tobin Frain's 20 now, doing engineering at Vesiter. He's never done another interview after the first one, and in the first one they asked him why he put the phone down, and he said, because everyone else had stopped moving and I was the only one still messing about. 13 years old. He worked that out on his own in 14 seconds, in a room full of adults where one grown man in a high-vis vest never worked it out at all. Ruari Neve retired last spring. We had a do for him at the wingspan. He wouldn't make a speech. Mrs. Alderway died in the January. She got to Vesiter, though. She saw her son. And I never spoke to Ilan Mercer. Not once. 19 feet away from him for 3 hours, and I never said a word to him, and I never have since. He's out now, left about 2 years back. Roswin says he sends Ada a card every November on the 14th, and it's never got anything in it except his name. People ask me what the shocking bit was. That's what they want when they hear I was there. They want the moment. They want the bit where somebody roars, or somebody swings, or a general comes storming through the terminal with a face like thunder, and puts the little man in the vest in his place. None of that happened. I'm sorry, it just didn't. A duty manager followed the rules, and a soldier stood still, and 140 strangers who'd never met each other and never would again worked out, without a single word passing between them, what the right thing was. That's the shocking bit. That's the whole of it. Because I'd have told you, before that Tuesday, 19 years of watching people at their absolute worst. People screaming at ground staff over 4 kilos of baggage. People shoving past a woman with a stick to get on a plane that isn't leaving for an hour. I'd have told you that a crowd is the worst version of us. And then I watched a crowd get it right in about 11 seconds flat, with nobody in charge, with no announcement, with no instruction, in the ugliest building in Harrowmere in the rain. Nobody told the tug driver to stop. Nobody told those kids to stand up. Nobody told Ruari Neve to take his hat off. There's a thing Roswin said to me in that kitchen in Balwick that I've carried around ever since. I'd been going on about Doyle, really going on. All the things I should have said, all the things I'd have said if I'd had my time again, 40 miles worth of it, and she let me run right out of steam like you'd let a tap run. And then she said, "Danny, he's not the story." And I said, "He nearly stopped it." And she said, "He didn't though, did he? He couldn't, not on his own." And she put the kettle down, and she said the thing. She said, "That's what nobody understands about that morning. It only took one man to try and stop it. It took 140 to let it happen." So that's what I'd leave you with, if you'll have it from a man who pushes wheelchairs. Ilan Mercer was the bravest man in that terminal. God knows. He'd been in the culvert. He'd been carried out of it. He got on a train at 4:30 in the morning with a leg full of metal, because a good lad from Balwick went back into a fire for him and never came out. But he wasn't the one who was tested that day. He'd already decided. He decided the second he heard nobody was going to be there, and after that there was nothing left in him to test. The rest of us were the ones being tested. The tug driver, the teacher, the lad with the cracked phone, Neve with his mortgage, Pikeman with his probation, me with my radio turned down to nothing and my knee going and 19 years I couldn't afford to lose. Every one of us had a perfectly good reason to keep walking. And nobody did. That's the bit I think about, at 10 to 9 in the morning, when the rain's coming in sideways off the marsh and the roof over the drop-off starts drumming. He stood there for 41 minutes, so a stranger wouldn't come home to an empty room. And for 39 of them, he stood there alone, and the only reason that's not the saddest thing I've ever seen is because of what the last 2 minutes looked like.